Well, welcome. Good evening. Thank you to Alana, who's doing the technical aspects tonight. She's the co-pilot. So if you're starting off by looking at the bowl of soup behind my head, it's really two bowls of soup. Matzo ball soup on one side and what's called Cuba soup on the other. Not Cuba, Cuba. That is a traditional, typical Sephardic soup, as opposed to the matzo balls, which are a typical Ashkenazic soup. So there you have, right in one bowl, it's actually two separate bowls, of course, but an illustration of this entire evening's discussion. So we're going to talk about the difference and the relationship and the reasons for the differences among Sephardic Jews compared to Ashkenazic Jews. Where did it all start? Where did it all go? And what's it doing today? Those are the issues we'll be discussing. If you have any questions, somehow communicate them to Alana. And
if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and then I'll relay them to the rabbi.
Excellent. Well, we'll chat, yes. So in talking about the origins of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewry, here's what we know, and there's a lot we don't know. But nowhere, anywhere in the Bible is the concept of an Ashkenazic Jew as opposed to a Sephardic Jew mentioned. So we know it didn't go back that far. Nowhere in the Talmud is Sephardic or Ashkenazic Jewry mentioned. The Talmud, we know, was finished, completed. We'll use the word published, but don't think of it in terms of modern publishing. It didn't mean it was printed. It means there were a handwritten copy and copies made of the handwritten copy. That was completed by around the year 500 CE. So there's no mention of Ashkenazic or Sephardic Jewry before 500, or 6, or 7, or 8, or 9. It really starts around the year 1000 or so. So how do we know about the three major faiths? Because that's really what this conversation tonight is about. The discussion of where Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews came from, not only where they came from physically, but where they came from culturally, is dependent on the fact that there were three major faiths: Judaism first, Christianity second, Islam third. Well, we know when Judaism started, back in the time of Abraham. That's around 15, 16, 1700 BCE. We know that Jesus lived around the year 1, hence the name the year 1. And that's when Christianity sort of begins, although it took a few decades for the religion of Jesus to become separate and apart from Judaism. And we know that figure the 1st century CE. The Islamic faith starts in the 600s with a gentleman by the name of Muhammad, who comes from Saudi Arabia, makes his way across the Middle Eastern desert, and basically is responsible for the literature, the text, the sacred text of the Islamic religion, which of course is called the Quran. So between the Old Testament, as it's called by Christians, we call it the Bible, they call it the Old Testament, and then of course comes the New Testament. We don't call it anything. They call it the New Testament. And then the Quran, you've got three stages in sacred scripture, all three of which claim to be divinely revealed, and that has a lot to do with the whole conversation tonight. So it's a divinely revealed sacred scripture plus a major individual prophet. So for the Jews, of course, it's Moses. For the Christians, it's, of course, Jesus. And for the Muslims, it's Muhammad. Now, when he crossed the desert, he influenced very effectively a whole lot of people all around him because he was the founder and the prophet. He swept across the Middle East, encouraging all kinds of followers throughout the region. He succeeded in elevating the influence of his scripture, the Quran, to that on the same level of the Old and New Testaments. And from the beginning, his approach combined adding the authority of both military, political, and religious all in one. And in only 100 years, 622 to 722, he and his successors, who are called caliphs, you've heard the phrase caliphate sometimes in the context of ISIS. The caliphs were Muhammad's successors, and the term itself means deputy of the prophet. So everyone who claimed to be a caliph had lots of followers, and followers means that they were successful in taking on the role that was started for them by Muhammad. By 722, the influence of this new religion swept all across the Middle East, all across North Africa, went up to Southern Europe, and made its way as far west as Spain. We'll leave the conversation there for a moment. Now I want you to consider the following question. How long does it take, do you think, for an idea to become a basic, foundational, tremendously big idea? In other words, somebody could sit in Brooklyn and dream up a religion. But in order to make it a religion, you've got to do certain things to get the concepts to grow and spread and become popular. And then you've got to interact with other existing religions so that more and more people will get in tune with your new one. I don't know how long that takes, but 100 years seems to me pretty quick. In addition, once you've developed an actual religion, how long do you think it takes for there to be enough masses in the new group that you've sufficiently turned enough people off? Because let's face it, we know something about people feeling they know better than others. Every faith seems to have that. So how long does it take to create a great religion? And then how long does it take to get internal dissent, opposition to the main leadership, so that there are alternative leaderships out there competing with each other, trying to establish themselves as the key leader? So that leads us to the following question. When you think of Muslims, now let's be honest here and let's be straightforward. When most people think of Muslims in general, the association is by and large not terribly positive. The association for most people seems to be that if you're a Muslim, you're a terrorist. If you're a Muslim, you're violent. If you're a Muslim, your religion, your Quran teaches you to be that violent and that unsociable. Now, whether it's true or not is a completely different question. But the fact that a lot of people believe that is part of the picture that the Muslim world has to deal with. So the question for us is, what does it have to do with us as Jews? And that's what I'm hoping to achieve with you this evening. So let's start. Alana, if you can get that first quote. There's a passage we're going to look at from a gentleman by the name of Bernard Lewis. Let's see if we can get this on there. Bernard Lewis is one of the world's best known scholars on the subject of the history and ideas of the Islamic faith and of the Islamic people. He wrote many books. He is the expert that people go to if you want to find anything out about the history or the ideas of Islam. Screen sharing. There we go. Beautiful. So a brief passage that has to do with the very stereotypes that I was just talking about, what most people think about when they think of Muslims. The truth is, there's two contrary stereotypes. Most of us never get to the other one. So Bernard Lewis writes, two stereotypes dominate most of what has been written on tolerance and intolerance in the Islamic world. So Bernard Lewis is cautioning us to realize that if you think that Muslims are all evil, cruel terrorists, there is an equally powerful stereotype on the other half. In fact, anytime there's a major brouhaha in the world between anybody and Muslims, especially when it comes to terrorists, you always find Islamic religious leaders defending and justifying their faith and saying it's a religion of peace. The word Islam has the word shalom in it, so they would even attest to that. In any event, so it's two conflicting stereotypes, and we have to keep both in mind. So the first one depicts a fanatical warrior, an Arab horseman riding out of the desert with a sword in one hand and the Quran in the other, offering his victims the choice between the two. The other image is that of an interfaith, interracial utopia in which men and women belonging to different races, professing different creeds, live side by side in a golden age of unbroken harmony. Both images are, of course, wildly distorted, yet both contain some elements of truth. So that's important to keep in mind, that there are two completely opposite viewpoints of the Islamic faith and Islamic history. If we can cut that off, Alana, and go back to faces. I like seeing faces more than pages. Anyway, welcome back. So here's the bottom line. The story of Ashkenazim and Sephardim can be summarized in one sentence, which might mean this is the shortest class in the history of classes. But I'll manage to fill up the hour, trust me. So the punchline to the story is the Sephardic Jews lived in countries where Muslims lived as well. The Ashkenazic Jews lived in countries where Christians lived as well. And that difference is the sum total of what you need to know to understand the various customs and practices that came down to us through the Sephardic tradition, through the Ashkenazic tradition. The word Ashkenaz, or the name Ashkenaz, means Germany, technically. But originally, it was meant to include the territories that today we call both Germany and France. Sephardic comes from Sfarad, which is the Hebrew word for Spain, which is where most of them came from. So, what's the difference and why does it matter? That's the whole story of this dynamic relationship and differences for us between Ashkenazic Jews and Sephardic Jews. Most Jews in America are Ashkenazic. Clear, simple. In fact, it's pretty hard to find Sephardic Jews these days. There are pockets of Sephardic Jewish population throughout the United States. Deal, New Jersey, specifically Syrian Jews, is very popular. There are other communities that have become primarily Sephardic. The rest of the country is pretty much Ashkenazic. Why and when did that happen? Mainly because of the influx of immigrants from Poland and Russia, Ashkenazic countries, towards the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, and certainly through World War I and World War II. So that's when the population totally reversed itself and became an Ashkenazic one in terms of the United States. So what's the deal between growing up as a Jew in a Christian country compared to growing up as a Jew in a Sephardic country? And the time frame we're talking about where these influences occurred is roughly 900 to 1200, give or take 100 years in either direction. Those were when these two communities split off. Around the year 1000, there was a great rabbi in Northern Europe. His name was Rabbeinu Gershom, who was shocked to find out that there were Jews, we now know to call them Sephardic Jews, mainly Jews who came from Middle Eastern countries, Northern Africa, Southern Europe, and they had a very interesting, strange practice, unknown to Ashkenazic Jews, and that was the fact that you could be married as a man to more than one wife. More than one wife. Polygamy. That was something that Rabbeinu Gershom found repulsive and issued a decree that this is not allowed according to Jewish law. Well, it was not allowed according to Jewish law only if you lived in countries where it was against the rules, which were the Christian countries. It was apparently fairly common, and actually there are pockets of Sephardic population in the world where it still exists. The Yemenite Jewish community in particular was fairly well known to have multiple wives. Anyway, that's where the break seems to have really started between the two. Now, let's talk about the two different faiths with whom we've interacted and help that to explain to us why there are differences. One of the things we know about the Islamic faith is at some point after they grew, after they expanded, and remember, they started out as a tribe of people in Saudi Arabia, Muhammad made his escape to Mecca and Medina, and that's how those two cities became holy cities for Muslims. And by the way, nowhere in the Quran does it mention Jerusalem as a holy city, in spite of what they say, but that's a different story. Anyway, from there, he spread out across, and the successors spread even further. They went all across North Africa, conquering each one of those countries on the way, turning them into Muslims, forcing them to learn and speak Arabic, adopting Muslim customs and practices. And once they satisfactorily conquered pretty much all of North Africa, there's about 10 countries that make up that area, they then set their sights on crossing the Mediterranean and starting to take over Europe. So they started, of course, in the south. That's where Spain and Portugal are. Now remember that Spain and Portugal are called collectively Iberia. So it's not just an airline, it's the combination of Spain and Portugal. So they set their sights on Spain and Portugal. They succeeded. Now, what does it mean to conquer them? Who was there before? Christians. So by conquering them, it meant they killed, imprisoned, and exiled, banished the Christian population and kicked them out. Where did they kick them out to? Well, they went further north. And that's how Christians overtook the northern, central, and eastern part of Europe. The Muslims only got as far as Spain and Portugal. To the other direction further east, they managed to get parts of southern France, parts of Italy, a few of the countries alongside there, but never got further north. That was as far as they could get. Now, at some point in this process, there were intellectuals among the leadership of this Muslim people, and one of the things they discovered was really a rediscovery of the ancient Greek philosophers. Now remember, the Greeks are BCE. We're talking now 1000 CE. So it's at least 1,000 years later, they rediscovered an interest in the Greek philosophers. So all of the classics of the Greeks were translated into Arabic as a reflection of that interest. They really loved this stuff. Don't know why, but they were into ideas, they were rational, they were intellectual, and from that, they branched off into other areas of intellectual pursuit. including math, science. After all, what do we call the numbers we use? We call them Arabic numerals, because it's the Arabs that created that whole number system. The other system is called Roman numerals. That would be Christian. But we're talking about the Muslims right now. So the Arabs brought the Greek philosophy with them. They brought science and math. They got into poetry. So our image of Muslims and of Arabs in particular as backward, as not intelligent, really was not true at all, at least certainly not then at this particular time. So they're going on and on and on. They're having a grand old time with their science, their poetry, their music, their art, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happening with the Jews who are living in those countries? What's happening is the Jews are starting to get into this stuff too. Now, why were the Jews not kicked out when the Christians were? Because the Jews didn't scare anybody. They were not in positions of power. They had no authority. They weren't a competing government. They weren't a competing anything. They were just happy to make a living, keep their nose clean, mind their own business. But once they started interacting with the newcomers, the Muslim newcomers, they discovered the Muslims had a revealed scripture, which they called the Quran. We had ours, we called the Torah, and that made us have something important in common. The story of prophets, for us Moses, for them Muhammad. We had that in common. And so they were they meaning the Muslims, were intellectually curious about other groups such as us, and they weren't afraid of us. To the contrary, they were encouraging this interaction. Now, there's another reason Jews were necessary, if you will, for these Muslims who were relatively new to these countries, North Africa and Southern Europe, and that is that Jews, God bless them, everywhere we went, eventually we got kicked out. Now, for most people, that's a bad thing. It was for us too, but we made the best out of it. Because once we got kicked out of a country and went to a new one, we knew the language of the country we just got kicked out of, because we lived there for a generation or two until their government got rid of us. But whatever it was, we had knowledge of language. And because we had knowledge of language, the Muslims who were interested in international trade needed people to communicate for them with the countries that they wanted to buy supplies from. That's where the Jews came in. That's how we got connected to business and all the stereotypes of Jews as business people. It was mainly the fact that we had language. The other thing we had, of course, not only was all the combination of all the languages that we learned along the way, but we also had Hebrew, which was like our secret weapon. That way we could communicate with each other and with Jewish communities in each of these countries, even while we were communicating with the non-Jews through their languages. So the Muslims really appreciated what the Jews had to offer. That led to appointing them to positions of importance. Suddenly, Jews were working as ambassadors. Who knew? Who would have thought that's possible? But now we're ambassadors for Spain and Portugal to other countries in the rest of the world, again, because we have the ability to communicate and represent our new country with the old country. So that made the Jews particularly valuable to the new Muslim rulers, and that's why they made us feel at home. So you had the combination of they needed us, they needed what the skills that we had, the fact that we shared in common scripture, philosophy, etc. And one of the main intermediaries in this whole process was a man you've all heard of. His name is Rambam, otherwise known as Moses Maimonides. Maimonides means the son of Maimon. That was his father's name. And his name was Moshe, the son of Maimon. Maimonides was one of the most unusual, dynamic, skilled, genius characters representative of this whole time period. There were many others like him. He was not the only one. but there were other people who were in positions of importance in Spain and Portugal who also had the skills of being great scholars in Jewish law, knew the Talmud, knew the Bible by heart, and could quote you and explain it and the whole works. Among these people were musicians and poets and sculptors and painters and all the arts that the Muslim world seemed to be enamored of. So when you look and ask yourself, how did this influence the Jews? If you look at pictures of synagogues that came from places like Spain and Portugal, you're going to see that they look more like a mosque that's from Spain or Portugal than it looks like another synagogue in Germany or France. They had more in common with their neighboring Muslims in Spain and Portugal than with their fellow Jews in Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. That's a remarkable accomplishment in Jewish history. Now, the other side of the coin is what was going on, meanwhile, in the Christian countries, the countries of Europe, where Jews still lived, but were now, and for always, were dominated by the Christians. They didn't do so well. They didn't do so well because the Christians did not share the Muslims' enthusiasm for all this modern stuff like art and poetry and science and math. They were more interested in conquest. They were also much less interested in interacting on an intellectual basis with other religious faiths. They were more concerned about proving the incorrectness of the Jewish religion and the correctness of the Christian religion. Remember that when Christianity first got started, it viewed itself as a group of Jews. But once the marketing campaign didn't succeed, in other words, they were not getting a whole lot of wholesale conversions to this new religion from Jews. The Jews were pretty much ignoring them. They then decided to go on a different marketing campaign and appeal to those people who were unaffiliated. And that's when Christianity really took off. That's why it took a century or two for that to happen. On the other hand, by 300 CE, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's pretty impressive. So they were always viewing the Jews as eternal sinners, proven by the fact that God did mankind a favor. It was divine grace that led God to send his son, Jesus, to take away our sins. It was such a simple thing to do. Suddenly, there's no longer 613 mitzvot. There's only one. Believe in God and the Son and the Holy Spirit. You buy that, you're sold. You're saved. You have salvation. That's all you got to do. And the Jews, of course, kept saying, we got 613, not just one. So they never got along. They never got to that point of reconciliation. And now it's a couple of hundred years later, and the Christians still want to prove that we're wrong and they're right, and that's all that mattered. Coupled with that, of course, is the simple explanation of anti-Semitism, and that is that, number one, they accused us of killing Jesus, that we were responsible for the execution, which, by the way, might have been the truth. We've been denying it for 2,000 years, but between me and you, it is possible. That nobody knows for sure. But regardless of that, because we killed him, according to them, and because we refused to accept the Son and the Father and the Holy Spirit as the real deal, we were doomed to living a life of sin. That's when they came up with the devil concept, and that's when they came up with the hell concept, and that's where they placed us, because God, in his infinite grace and love, was doing us a favor to make it easier on us, and we continued to reject the idea. So therefore, We are eternally, until we become true Christians and accept the word of God according to them, we are doomed to eternal punishment. So therefore, if there is ever a massacre against our people, even if it's not perpetrated by Christians, the Christians, their viewpoint is, aha, that's the punishment that God kept threatening. Now it's finally happening. And you can take it up to the Pope during the Holocaust if you want. But the whole conversation, that syndrome never existed between Jews and Muslims. We got along great. Go figure. It's one of the biggest ironies of Jewish history that the one people we seem to have the most problems with today, with the exception of the UAE, of course, but other than that, it's assumed to be a relationship that can never get fixed. But the reality is, if you go back to the heyday, the golden age, it was a wonderful relationship of mutual admiration, mutual respect. And they were impressed that we could produce poets who would write in Hebrew or Arabic, that we could produce a Rambam who could communicate with any of them on their Greek philosopher ideas, who could share with them the genius of the Jewish religion. And from the standpoint of Jews, he could also be a major leader and summarizing Jewish ideas, Jewish law, Jewish principles, and everything else. So he became the leading spokesman for our faith, our history, our traditions, our culture, everything. Now, there's one other thing that makes the story get even more interesting, and that is towards the middle to end of Rambam's life, things started to turn a little bit. Some Muslims in Spain, and that's where Rambam came from, some Muslims started turning against the Jews. Not in an openly overwhelming way, but just enough to send shivers down a few people's spines. And that led to some migrations of Jews away from Spain and Portugal. And then suddenly, now remember the picture, Spain and Portugal were Christian countries. The Christians were kicked out by the Muslims took over and ran the country. And during that time, the Jews did great. But eventually, the Christians who were kicked out of Spain and Portugal got strong enough, got better organized enough to reorganize themselves militarily and otherwise and come back down towards Spain and Portugal and reconquer it. Now we're talking 1400s. So we've had 300 years of great life living under Muslim rule. Those 300 years are called the Golden Age of Spanish Jewry. Again, roughly 900 or 1,000 to 12 or 1,300. But it turns around once the Christians reconquer Spain and Portugal. Because as soon as they reconquer Spain and Portugal, that means the negativity of their relationship with Jews takes over the positivity of the Muslim relationship with Jews. And now there's no Muslims to have mutuality with them. They're gone. So now the Jews are left on their own, and overnight, practically, they become victims of Christian world. So when we think of Sephardic Jews, they are people whose roots remember the good days of interacting with Arabs and Muslims. Ashkenazic Jews, pretty much with one exception we'll get to in a moment, with that one exception, other than that, had a pretty miserable time living in most Christian countries. The exception is Poland, obviously pre-World War II. So if you go back to 1000, you realize that Germany and France, the hotbed of Ashkenazi culture, life wasn't so great because they were typically Christian-ruled countries and made our lives relatively miserable. What does that mean? There were certain professions they wouldn't allow us to engage in. There were, I would call them costumes. There were dress codes for Jews. The idea of the Jewish yellow star that became famous in the Holocaust didn't start with them. The forcible wearing of certain identifiably Jewish clothing goes back to those early years. You also had, they couldn't own land. So all of these things led to the miserable life conditions of Jews living in those French countries. Poland in the year 1000 had wide open space, and they had a non-religious / secular government that decided migration to Poland is a good thing. We don't care what their religion is because we don't care about any religion. That's how Poland was built in the year 1000. It changed shortly after that because just after they started welcoming Jews to come from Germany and France and live in Poland and allowed them to have all kinds of work and jobs, within 100 years they converted and became officially a Catholic country, and then things went downhill again. But at least we had a small period of time when that's when most of the great yeshivas were built. Some of the great rabbis of Polish Jewry history lived and taught and had their influence felt on the Jewish populations. And from that, we had a great living relationship with the two. Of course, 1 week is what it took for Germany to conquer Poland in World War II, and everything immediately went to hell after that. But we had a good, this is what most people don't know, because Poland became the world's largest center of Jewish population. At the Holocaust, as it began, there were over 3 million Jews in Poland alone. And now there's maybe a couple of thousand, 2,000, 3,000 at the most. So it shows you what Jewish life might have been had that never occurred. But it shows what a monumental event the Holocaust was on European Jewry, but Polish Jewry in particular. So for 1,000 years, we were more or less welcome, more or less comfortable. There were pogroms, there were massacres, there were all kinds of bad moments, but most of that 1,000 years was fairly productive, let's call it that, from the standpoint of the Jewish population there. Excuse me, then it all turned around. Now, back in Spain, what we see is that Rambam, back in 1200, was dealing with the fact that the Muslims who were changing, who were becoming a little less hospitable, and the fact that there was talk of the Christians who were removed, were talking about making a comeback, so the Jewish population was getting a little uptight. And meanwhile, there were a feel, especially as the Christians were succeeding in taking town after town after town back, what happened immediately was they were resentful of the fact that the Jews had all these positions of importance. Christians were not used to that. They were not used to seeing Jews in important positions. So they immediately removed them and fired them and said, you can't have this job, that job, that job. You have to wear these clothes. You can't live in this place. You have to live in that place. So all that was going on, and a lot of Jews decided, but if I convert, I can have those jobs. I can make a decent living. I can continue being happy. And a lot of Jews who were not forced into it, who were not impelled or imposed upon them, they decided to fake it and just become Christians in word alone and not make a big deal out of it. And the Christians couldn't do anything about it, because if they accepted even if they were faking it, they were told, if you say these words and do the following things, you do the Sabbath on Sunday, you get yourself baptized, you do this, you do that, you're a Christian. And then we can't prevent you from having the job you want. So Jews decided, hey, that's a good deal. Let's do it. And so they started, in growing numbers, faking their conversion. It took about 100 years. When the numbers of people who were doing this was growing, most of these people didn't think of themselves as Christians. They thought of themselves as Jews, but they figured it was, got to make a living. So they went along with it, and the numbers started growing. As it grew, the Christians got more and more suspicious that this was not a good thing. They got more and more hostile and negative, and that's when it led to calling these people Moranos, which of course is a term for swine or pigs. The Jews called themselves Anusim, which is Hebrew for the ones who were forced into it. They didn't want to admit that they did it voluntarily. And the Spanish name was Conversos, which simply means those who converted. So now that the Christians are slowly taking over, they were now giving the Jews a choice. You can die or you can convert, but for real. So if, Alana, if you can put the second passage on, there's one more quotation I want us to read. It's from Rambam, who's dealing with this whole question of, is it against Jewish law to pretend to be a Christian? So here's what he says, quoted in a book about Maimonides' texts that he wrote himself, written by Abraham Helkin, a great scholar. Remember that in all the difficulties that occurred in the time of the sages, that means earlier, back in the days of the Talmud, they were compelled to violate commandments and to perform sinful acts. But in this persecution, they are not required to do anything but say something, so that if a man wishes to fulfill the 613 commandments secretly, he can do so. He incurs no blame for it, meaning by the Muslims or Christians. This compulsion imposes no action, only speech. They, the Muslims, know full well that we don't mean what we say, and that what we say is only to escape the ruler's punishment and to satisfy him with this simple confession. But if anyone comes to ask me whether to surrender his life or acknowledge, I tell him to confess and not choose death. So Rambam is basically saying, you want to know my advice? Convert. Go through the conversion process, do what you got to do, say what you got to say, because it's just words. And basically, that's what inspired a generation of these people. Okay, Alana, we can go back to faces. Thank you. There you are. Hope you had a nice rest. So that's kind of what Rambam said to them. Now, let's take this a couple of steps further. The Crusades, of course, are in there, but we're going to skip over that story. There is a great text that I'm sure you've all heard of. It's called the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch means the set table. Now, what's the story with the Shulchan Aruch? If you ask any religious Jew, any Jew who's knowledgeable, even minimally, they will probably have heard of the Bible. They will most likely have heard of the Talmud, and then they will most likely be able to recognize the name Shulchan Aruch, or Shulchan Aruch, to be correct. So what exactly is the Shulchan Aruch? Well, it's really two books in one. And it started with a gentleman by the name of Rabbi Joseph Caro, who lived in, also started out in Spain, ended up in Tzfat in the northern part of Israel, living among the mystics who had gravitated towards that city, and became a great magnet, attracting all kinds of Torah scholars. And along the way, he wrote books on Jewish law and decided to write the book of Jewish law. That's what the Shulchan Aruch is. He takes all the laws that had been proposed and included in the Talmud, and it's now in 1500. So it's like 1,000 years later. So he wants to update the latest, greatest book on Jewish law. and it's written in a different style than the Talmud. It's just laws, it's no legends, no values, simply sticking to the law, one after another, in a sequential order that made sense to him, starting with the first thing you do in the morning. That's where he begins. First thing you do in the morning is you get out of bed and you proclaim your love of God. And then from there, he goes and describes the morning rituals of washing and getting dressed and how you should get dressed. And then the prayers, of course, you say, et cetera, et cetera. And he takes you through a typical day. And that's how he sequenced his book on Jewish law. Apparently, because he came from Spain, that means, of course, he grew up in this background that we would call the Sephardic world. But at the same time that he's doing that, or within a few decades of it, there's another great rabbi named Rabbi Moses Isserlis. And because it's Rabbi, which starts with a resh, and Mem, which stands for Moshe, and Aleph for Isserlis, you put the three initials together, it spells the Ramah. The Ramah was the name of the chief rabbi of Krakow, Poland. And if you go to Krakow, Poland today, which if you're going to go to Poland, you're naturally going to go to Auschwitz. Auschwitz is about a 45-minute drive from Krakow. Krakow was like the southern capital. Warsaw was about 3 hours by car to the north. In Krakow, there's a shul called the Ramah Synagogue. This literally is the shul that this rabbi davened in and conducted services. There's a cemetery behind the shul where the Ramah is buried next to his brother and sister. By the way, it's one of the neatest things I've ever noticed. When you stand there looking at these three graves, you realize that the Ramah is the leader of the pack, and his name is Moshe. What do you think his sister and brother's names are? Miriam and Aharon. And you don't realize that till you're looking at these three gravestones. It's a remarkable thing. Imagine their parents, when they were born, thought about having those three be their children. Anyway, there's a lot of other rabbis whose names appear on the pages of the Talmud, not in the Talmud itself, but the later commentators, marginal notes. They're buried in the same cemetery. There's about a couple of hundred graves in this cemetery. Anyway, Rabbi Moses Isserlis was doing the same thing Rabbi Joseph Caro did. And he starts writing the latest, greatest book of Jewish law. But he lives in Poland. So he only knows about Ashkenazic practices. He doesn't even know about Sephardic one, doesn't know they're different, doesn't know anything about it. There's no interaction. There's no email. There's no Wi-Fi. There's nothing. It's the 1500s. So he goes about and writes his book on Jewish law. And Rabbi Caro's apparently got to a printer first, because that is around the time the printing is starting. And his book got published first, but a printer 50 years later came up with the brilliant idea, if we have the greatest mind of the Sephardic world and the greatest mind of the Ashkenazic world doing the same thing, let's put them together. So an editor kind of synthesized the two texts so that for every point of law that Rabbi Caro was telling his answer, Rabbi Isserlis's not response, but his view on what that law is interspersed. And the way you know the difference is they use two different fonts. Think of print and italics as a way of imagining what it looks like. And so the print would be the Caro words, and the italics would be Isserlis's words. And you read it as if they were dialoguing with each other, which they didn't. They probably never met, never knew, never even heard about each other. But that's how you bring the two great together. And that's why the Shulchan Aruch is such an important book, because it has the best of both the Ashkenazic and Sephardic worlds. So that's more or less the story. There's so much more to talk about, but I see we're kind of running out on time. What I want to do with the last couple of minutes is talk about, if I can find it, here we go. How the difference in where they lived, meaning the culture within which they lived, impacted on customs, practices, and their respective views on Jewish law. So one of the main examples that we all know has to do with food on Passover. And they eat rice. Ooh. And they eat beans and peas and all those things that we're told from the time we're born. Don't you ever touch that on Passover. Yuck. That's disgusting. That's terrible. That's a big sin. You can't do that. We've all been raised that way. So the question is, why did the Ashkenazic Jews refrain from eating this stuff? And why, if it's such an obvious thing to the Ashkenazim, is it that the Sephardic Jews don't? So here's the answer. It's unbelievable. It all has to do with the lifestyle that I tried to outline this evening. The life of the Jews who lived in Sephardic countries, meaning Muslim countries, was relatively peaceful. And because it was relatively peaceful, and relatively speaking, there was no discrimination, oppression, or tyranny that the Jews there felt, their eating habits tended to be different. They would eat things that were not a concern of what it might mean. In the Ashkenazi countries, because they were mistreated in general, they were poorer in general. The typical Ashkenazi Jew was much more poor than the typical Sephardi Jew back then. That led the Ashkenazi Jews to use all kinds of different products to make what is the main essence of a meal is, of course, bread. So you would make bread-like foods out of corn, out of peas, out of peanuts, out of all the things that were not rice, and they would make them, grind them down into a flour, doughy-like substance, add a little bit of this, add a little bit of that, put it in the oven, bake it a little bit, and out comes a bread made out of peas, or made out of corn, or made out of rice. And that's why the Ashkenazic authorities were worried that if we were allowed to eat this stuff on Pesach, even though the Torah doesn't prohibit it, then people might mix it up and think that they're eating bread, and God forbid we don't want that to happen. So therefore, we're going to simply say you can't eat any product from these foods, but the Sephardi authorities never worried about mixing up a rice bread or a pea bread or a corn bread with bread, because nobody ate that stuff. Because the the Sephardim were not as desperate to find substitute food items. So the whole kitniyot issue is of that type. You should know that, very interesting, modern Israel today, you walk down the street during Passover, and during the year, every restaurant that has rabbinic supervision, kashrut supervision, has a certificate prominently displayed so anybody can see that this is a kosher restaurant. For Passover, there's two different ones. One for Ashkenazic Jews, one Sephardic Jews. They're different colors. That's how you keep in mind which one it is. And if it's an Ashkenazi certificate, it means there's no legume products in that restaurant. If it's a Sephardi kashrut certificate, it means you do have all that stuff. So it's up to you to decide. But the other thing is interesting is the leadership of the conservative movement in Israel has decided that it's a different world we live in, and therefore it no longer is that. Also, there's so much more interaction. There's intermarriage between Ashkenazim and Sephardic Jews, and more families are confused. What do you do? What can you not do? And do we want to make this a battle because I grew up Ashkenazic, you grew up Sephardic? What happens when your parents are here and my parents are here? They're going to kill each other. So in order to reflect the fact that in Israel there's so much more coming together of the different ethnic groups, the conservative movement leadership has pronounced that it's okay for a conservative Ashkenazi Jew to eat legumes on Passover. I'm not telling you should. I'm just telling you if you happen to be in Israel, that's a different story. Let's go through some other customs and practices where there are differences today. You saw the soup behind me with the matzo ball soup on one side, the kuba soup on the other. So that's a reflecting the different customs and dietary things. Hanukkah. You'd never believe there's a difference in Hanukkah, but there is, and you need to know about it, but you may not have thought about it this way. And that is, what is considered the primary food item to eat on Hanukkah? Well, for most of us, it's a potato latke. But believe it or not, the Sephardic Jews say jelly donuts. They're both fried, so they both qualify. But the whole idea of two separate major items being the Hanukkah dish is reflecting on the significant population of Sephardic Jews who say it should be a jelly donut, and the Ashkenazi Jew that say it should be a potato pancake. So the best thing to do is take one of each. You should know that in Israel, there are a number of major chains of baked goods. And they all have restaurants and coffee shops. Some of them, you just go for a dessert type thing. Some of them have full meals that they serve in addition. But all the places that make donuts, and there's a half a dozen major chains of these stores that each one has hundreds of franchises around the country. They have an annual contest, donut contest, the couple of weeks before Hanukkah. And this to see who can make the wickedest donut imaginable, meaning how many piles and gobs of covers and icings and chocolate and whipped cream and nuts and everything you can imagine. And the donut suddenly goes like this. And they are unbelievable, but that's a big annual contest. And because one particular chain for like 6 years in a row won the contest, the other companies decided we're quitting. They didn't want to have a contest anymore because they knew they couldn't win. So now they all put out their donuts and everybody has fun. Language, of course, is a difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. We both have a secret code. For Ashkenazi Jews, of course, it's Yiddish, which is a combination of German and Hebrew. The Sephardic Jews also have a secret language. It's called Ladino, which is a combination of Spanish and Hebrew. So obviously that's a reflection of where they came from. The naming ceremony of a baby is, of course, a different practice. We are all accustomed to the fact that, and we can't believe anybody has a different custom, but our custom, of course, is you always name after a deceased relative, a parent, a grandparent, an uncle, an aunt, and that's considered absolute law according to Ashkenazi Jews. But the Sephardi Jews are just as convinced that the best way to honor somebody's memory is to honor them while they're still alive. And so their practice tends to be to name after somebody who is still living, a living grandparent, a living uncle or aunt. So that's a big difference. Musical chants, very different from one to another. You can kind of hear from our standpoint, well, I'd rather not say, but the ear of an Ashkenazi Jew is different than the ear of a Sephardi Jew. And it all goes back to living in Europe or living in Southern Europe, living where German, Russian, Polish is the native language. The language sounds different than Spanish or Portuguese. And because the language sounds different, the music is different, the chant is different, the notes that you use are different. Finally, there's the issue of prayers. You look at a Sephardic prayer book, and for an Ashkenazi Jew, you can get lost because you don't recognize a lot of the prayers. The wording can be different. The chant can be different, as I said. The whole question of whether you sit or stand for a prayer, a particular prayer, is different in a Sephardic shul as compared to Ashkenazi. In many Ashkenazi shuls, some people stand for any Kaddish. Half Kaddish, full Kaddish, mourner's Kaddish, people stand. In a Sephardic synagogue, it's more common to sit if you're not a mourner. So that's another difference in practice. Nobody knows why, but that's one of the differences. The last thing I'll say, and then we'll see if you have any questions, is the interesting thing about the Sephardic community and the way they've organized their society is that some of the things we take for granted, and one in particular, we Ashkenazic Jews, and I'm assuming most of us are Ashkenazi, it's a pretty good bet, but most Ashkenazi Jews are used to the fact that we have 4 denominations. We got Orthodox, we got Conservative, we got Reform, we got Reconstructionist. The truth is that in the Sephardic world, that never happened. And that is fascinating. One of the reasons it didn't happen is because they tend to be more flexible, more willing to consider a broader interpretation. And that is probably due to the way they were treated by the Muslim governments that they lived under, where they were all welcomed and appreciated and mutually respected. And so they were able to transpose that mutual respect to differences within the Jewish community. So they never broke off into separate movements or denominations. They managed to be all-encompassing. That's my 2 cents for tonight. Let's see if we have any questions.
So I'm going to go from the chat first, and then if anyone wants to raise their hand with the little icon on the bottom after we're done with the chat, I'll call on you. So Ivy Tenenbaum wrote, Rabbi, growing up during Pesach was a challenge in my family. My maternal grandfather was Sephardic, Spain to Turkey to New York. However, the rest of my family were from Poland and Russia. One Seder was always spent with my Sephardic family. Rice was served. That's the first comment.
Okay.
Linda Storfer wrote, if an Ashkenazic woman marries a Sephardic man, is she obligated to take on her husband's customs and traditions? What about the reverse?
Yeah, so the answer is most religious authorities, and it doesn't matter which religion or which denomination, rightly or wrongly, tend to veer towards the male dominance. Rightly or wrongly, that still seems to be the case in many circles. My answer would be, the best thing you got to do is, like everything else in marriage, you got to learn how to compromise, and you got to figure it out. But you should talk it through before you go ahead and get married, because you don't want it to become a source of friction. The truth is, it happens so much more frequently in Israel because of the intermingling of the ethnic groups. And the Sephardic group, if you go back 100 years, the Sephardim were kind of like ignored because most of the leadership was Ashkenazic. The Ben-Gurions of the world were all Ashkenazic Jews. And they didn't really have a great deal of respect for the Sephardic traditions because they didn't have a great deal of respect for the Sephardic community. That's changed dramatically, having to do with the Sephardic chief rabbis who've asserted themselves, and there's many, many more Sephardic Jews are big names in the government. And so they have more influence and more power. Relating to a marriage, like anything else, it's a lot of compromising.
And then Ken shared with us that in his family, it was a blending. And Ivy shared that the Sephardic family I grew up with had 3 Seders, 2 at the beginning and 1 to conclude. No English was spoken, just Ladino.
Wow. There actually is a practice in Israel among the Sephardic community of a last day of Passover is considered a Maimuni, based on the name for Rambam. It's a day in which you have special meals and special prayers that you recite. It's sort of like another Seder, but it's strictly among the Sephardic community. I will tell you that the distinction between the family I grew up and the family Melinda grew up in was not as stark a difference as Ashkenazi Sephardi, but different melodies. You know, I grew up with melodies that I learned at my father's table and mother's table, and Melinda had different melodies that she learned from her father and mother. And so it took a while till we figured out, well, you know, in America, you got two seders, so that's a good thing. So you can use one set of melodies one night and use another set the next night. And that way everybody's traditions are honored, which is important.
That's all I have in the chat right now. Does anyone want to raise their hand? Linda, let me unmute you. And then Ken, I see.
He's not unmuted yet.
Can you got to click the. You're not unmuted. You have to click the button.
Okay,
There you
okay.
go.
Can you hear me? The Rabbi, the Ethiopians in Israel, Ethiopian Jews, they're not really Sephardim or Ashkenazim, are they? They're not Sephardim, but
Correct.
So can you give us your perspective as having lived in Israel for so many years? They used to say, the Ashkenazim, it's still true, they look down upon the Sephardim, the dark skin, the very racist. But then somebody said, but that's what the Sephardim do now, today, with the Ethiopians. Is that common from your perspective?
There have been a number of terrible incidents involving police, too parallel to what we're seeing in the streets of America. But on the other hand, it's rare enough, but common enough that we can't ignore it. We can't sweep it under the carpet, but it's also not to the point that it is here. The incidents are fairly rare, thank God. It shouldn't happen at all. There clearly is prejudice against the Ethiopian community. There's also a significant community that walked across the globe from Sudan. So the Sudanese have a different look than the Ethiopians, even though, you know, they're dark colored skin, they're different shades, and so that makes a difference. But the government of Israel, all the governments, not just the current one, still has a lot of work to do to avoid the terrible mistakes we've made in America with people of color, assuming that they're only good to be housemaids, house cleaners, and that's got to be really addressed seriously by this and any subsequent government. They've got an agenda ahead of them. On the other hand, there are some incredibly wonderful things that have happened. Interaction. Last year, I met a gentleman who grew up in Ethiopia, decided to become a rabbi, and got training, was accepted and acknowledged, and ironically, ended up in a little development town called Kiryat Gat, which is a development town means most of the people are middle class and less, not middle class and more or higher. And he ended up getting a job as the rabbi of a shul, and that's where we met him, in his shul, that was mostly Ashkenazi, elderly, a lot of Holocaust survivors.
Oh my gosh.
The Rabbi was like an 88-year-old Holocaust survivor who introduced the rabbi to us. And he said, the number one question I get asked all the time is, what's doing here? How did you hire? Why are you hiring this black man to be your rabbi? It's kind of weird. And his answer was, and continues to be, your neshama doesn't have a color. And I thought that was a beautiful response. And then I got up and told us his life story, how he walked across Africa and made his way to Israel and eventually rediscovered his parents, who we thought were dead. Just an amazing story. This is a success story. And the fact that he's got a community of elderly white gentlemen, mainly, who are very loving and admiring and respectful of him, says a lot. So there's more stories of that than the other, fortunately. But they still got a long way to go.
Thank you.
And Heidi wrote in the chat that there were 11 police-related killings of Ethiopians in 22 years.
22 years? Or, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yeah, well, like I said, one is too many. But, yeah.
I'm just looking to see, Sheila and Gary have a question.
Unmuted.
Okay. There.
Do you want to comment on to fill in wrapping clockwise versus counterclockwise, or the arm to you or away from you, versus Sephardic and Ashkenazic customs?
I'm not sure what the question is.
The question is,
Why do some do it one way and some the other?
Yeah, is that Sephardic and Ashkenazic or not necessarily? Whether you wrap towards you or away from you?
One is called the Rabbeinu Tam way of doing it, and the other is called the Rashi way of doing it. Two different rabbis. Turns out both of them were Ashkenazic, but they obviously disagreed on the right way. So some differences are based on Ashkenazi Sephardi. Some of them go back even longer to the days of the Talmud, when you had part of the community living in Israel and part of the community living in Babylonia. Like when you see in the Siddur, let's see, passages like Modim Anachnu Lach in the Amida. And then right after that, there's always a passage that nobody pays attention to, but says when the Shliach Tzibor or Chazan is reciting the Modim, the congregation recites this one. It's a slightly different version. Or you have the Sim Shalom as opposed to the Shalom Rav. So you do one for Shacharit and the other for Mincha and Marv. Some of those differences are based on Sephardic Ashkenazic background. Most of those kinds of differences go back to the Israeli community in the Talmudic period versus the Babylonian community. So each difference that exists, and thank God we Jews have plenty of differences, it all depends. You never know which one. I mean, there are books you can look at that will suggest what's the background of that particular dispute. But most of them are just because, just like us, you know, we grow up with different customs that we saw in our parents' home, and they saw in their parents' home, and they saw in their parents' home, and that's how most of us get our customs. It's not a question of right and wrong.
Okay, I'm just looking if there are any other hands that are not, that are raised like in the screens and not
Let me add that next week we're going to be talking about the Hasidic movements, how the Hasidim got started, and who opposed them, which is the word mitnagdim, the opponents. Who were the opponents and why? So we'll talk about that. That'll be our final session in this series. We've got a couple of things coming up for the holidays that we want everybody to know about. Some of them have been finalized as we speak.
I actually have a list of everything.
Excellent. Go for it.
These are all our exciting upcoming programs. So Rabbi said his final class is next week, September 1st. Then on September 14th at 7 p.m., we have Rosh Hashanah, a gift of tshuva, a class led by Mindy Islander, and that will be on Zoom. On September 16th at 11 a.m., we will have a shofar blowing in our parking lot. On September 21st, Rabbi will do tashlich for us, the pond in his backyard, on Facebook Live. Then on the 23rd at 5 p.m., we will have another shofar blowing in the parking lot. Also on the 23rd, we will have Mindy Islander again on Zoom. She's going to be talking about Yom Kippur, the gift of deadlines. And then on October 6th, we have the Temple Beth Sukkot Zoom extravaganza, and we'll be providing more information on that momentarily. And then on October 7th, we are having biblical humor in honor of Simchat Torah with Rabbi Kieffer. That'll also be at 7 p.m. on Zoom. So please join us for all these exciting upcoming programs.
All right. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed. And let's start repenting.
Thanks.
Thank you, Laura.
Good night.